Sharma. She is a professor of ophthalmology at RP Center, AIMS. From what I know, if there is any one busy ophthalmologist in India right now, busiest, it is Dr. Namrata Sharma. And we are so blessed that she has made out time from her busy schedule to bless all the postgraduates over here with her teaching presentation. We are so grateful to you, ma'am, for your time. We also have Dr. Sagar Bhargav with us, who is a consultant at BBI Foundation, Kolkata, and he will be the moderator for today's session. I'd like to request Dr. Sagar Bhargav to please take over.
Thank you, Dr. Satyajit. It's indeed a pleasure and privilege to be here amongst all the postgraduates, and again, doing a great job. So I think let's begin with the talks today. Madam can start her first presentation. Probably we will divide the presentations in the two presentations. So we'll have question answer again after each session, or do it at the end.
Whatever you want to do it. I mean, I can do it. Let's begin first, and then we'll go as it goes.
Okay. So the first topic was on corneal ectasia, and the second one is on bacterial keratitis. Corneal ectasia was to be covered by Dr. Professor Rasik Bajpai, but he is unable to join us today. So ma'am has been very kind. We are very grateful to her for having agreed to cover that topic also for the postgraduates. So we will begin with corneal ectasia now. Dr. Namrata Sharma. Dr. Namrata Sharma is also the Secretary of All India Ophthalmological Society in her second term, and one of the most dynamic secretaries of All India Ophthalmic Societies, and we are so blessed to have her with us today.
Is it sharing the?
Yes, ma'am.
It's sharing the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, yes.
It is? Okay.
Yes.
It's sharing, no? So I can begin?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, please.
Okay. So at the outset, I would like to thank Satyajit Sinha for starting this program from the ABI Institute for the postgraduates in ophthalmology, and True for having me here amongst all of you. And this is an opportunity to interact with all of you and to teach all of you. And we learn by teaching. So I'm going to be talking about two topics today to you. One is corneal ectasia's diagnosis and management, and the other is peripheral ulcerative keratitis. Now, my submission to you would be that try and learn everything in this session itself, in the sense that after you heard this talk and the next, you should not be, there should be no need for you to revise it. You just mug it up now and here. So I've tried to make it with pictures, with photographs, and with videos so that they get stuck to your photographic memory. And you don't have to go and look back, the same thing in the books. So corneal ectasia generally for you in the postgraduate exam may come as a long case, may come as a short case. The investigations of this pentachem, etc., may be there for you in the viva, or may be there for you to see in your when they are testing your investigative modalities. So the ectasias could be primary, such as keratoconus, pellucid marginal degeneration, Tyrrell's marginal degeneration, or they can be iatrogenic. So iatrogenic means after a surgery, so it could be post-LASIK, PRK, intacs, RK, and penetrating keratoplasty ectasia. If you see the first one, that is keratoconus, it is the commonest. Incidence is 1 in 2000. Non-inflammatory corneal ectasia. It is generally bilateral, 90% of the times, asymmetrical. It starts in teens, progresses till 40s, and generally is an isolated disease. There is no sex preponderance, and 6 to 8% of them have positive family history. Etiology is idiopathic, but it is said that the genetic, biomechanical, and the biochemical factors, they play a role. So if you look at the genetics, 6 to 8% of the subjects with keratoconus had affected relatives, and 19 pairs of monozygotic twins affected with keratoconus have been reported in literature, and there are several loci which are associated with it. So you need to remember two of them, VSX1 and SOD1. So VSX1 and SOD1. So if somebody asks you which genes, if you say these two words, it's good enough. Then there can be associations which could be systemic, such as Downs, atopy, mitral valve prolapse, Ehlers-Danlos, Turner's, Marfan's, Eppert syndrome. Then there can be ocular associations such as VKC, Leber's, retinitis pigmentosa, eye rubbing, aniridia, blue sclera, and ectopia lentis. And you have to diagnose keratoconus based on the clinical diagnosis or on the investigation. So the patient could be asymptomatic and the only sign is inability to refract to 6/6. And in advanced stages, there can be significant distortion of vision with decrease in vision. And if the patient has vernal catarrh, and keratoconus is quite common in these cases, there can be itching, redness, and watering. In the early disease, you have scissoring on the retinoscopy, and on retroillumination, there will be an oil droplet-like sign, which is the shoulder sign, which can be seen here. And in early disease, you can have what is called as the Flescher's ring. So this ring that you note here, yellowish ring, which is seen best under the cobalt blue filter, is the Flescher's ring, which is seen in the early stage. Then apart from this, there can be prominent corneal nerves such as can be seen here. And then there can be Vogt stria, which are present at the level of they are vertical stria present at the level of the Bowman's layer, and they are there because of stretching of the cornea. In advanced cases, you can have Rizzuti phenomena, Munson sign, severe thinning and scarring. So this is Rizzuti phenomena. So if you shine the torch from one side, torchlight, it will brightly focus onto the temporal side. From the nasal side, the torch is being shown. Munson sign is that it is so severe that when you just pull the lid down, you can actually see that there's notching which is present on the lid because of the ectatic cornea. Then you can have corneal ectasia, which is so very well seen here, and then you can have scarring. Scarring mainly occurs because this Descemet's membrane at the back, it ruptures and the aqueous enters inside this this area, and so it leads to corneal edema. And when that acute hydrops it gets healed, then it leads to the formation of a scar. Now, how do you differentiate between corneal scar and corneal edema? In corneal edema, corneal thickness would always be increased, but in corneal scar, the corneal thickness would always be decreased. So both of them would look white in color, but if it is thinned out, it's a scar. If it is increased thickness, it's edema. Lucid marginal degeneration, on the other hand, is bilateral, asymmetric, and there's 1 to 2 millimeters here of the area which is uninvolved near the limbus, and there's peripheral band of thinning inferiorly. Then there can be corneal protrusion, which is most marked above the area of thinning at 4 to 8 o'clock position. And central cornea is generally normal. And on the VKG or corneal topography, you will have a classic butterfly appearance and against the rule astigmatism. Keratoglobus, as the name suggests, the cornea is completely globular, 360 degrees globular. So again, it tends to be bilateral, progressive. The entire cornea is thinned out, the entire cornea is deep, and it is often associated with blue sclera and other systemic features, and it is prone to corneal rupture from even minimal trauma. See, look at this cornea, which is so globular, and in the side view, you can see like a globule of the cornea, which is sitting there. Now, how do you differentiate? I've told you by and large what the features are for differentiation, but you can click a picture of this because it will just help you to, explain to the examiner as to how you differentiate from keratoconus, pellucid marginal degeneration, and keratoglobus. Now, in the exams, what happens is that you may not know everything, and perhaps you're not supposed to know everything. But if you know something about everything, and if the correct terms, correct terminology, correct words technically, if you speak, then the examiner immediately knows that you know your subject. So it is very important to, speak correctly to at least the initial 2-3 sentences, 2-3 statements should be correct and should be in alignment with the examiner, so that immediately he will know that, So for instance, if you say for a differential diagnosis, if you start explaining to him in the manner which is in the table, he or she would immediately know that you know your subject and you know what you're talking about. Now, Tyrrell's marginal degeneration, which also falls into the differential diagnosis, generally affects superiorly. And it may be there in the inferior cornea. I've shown you this picture, which is superior, so that it gets fixed in your mind and you know that Tyrrell's is classically superior. Then what can you see here? You can see that there are vessels here, so it is involved with vascular invasion. You can see that there's a lipid deposit here, so it is accompanied by lipid deposit. So both the things are there with the pterions. Whereas these things will not be there with keratoconus or keratoglobus or pellucid marginal degeneration. Now, this is what I was telling you, acute corneal hydrops. So what happens? The cornea becomes so active that the Descemet's membrane at the back, it gives way. So when it gives way, the aqueous escapes into this cornea and it causes corneal edema, as you can see here. This is also white, but the corneal thickness is very much increased. Now, clinical features, if you see of acute hydrops in advanced cases, the patient will suddenly say that my eyes become white. There would be pain, diminution of vision, conjunctival injection, corneal edema. And these cases, what is classically advised is that you should patch, use hypertonic saline, topical steroids, cycloplegic agents, and anti-glaucoma. And the surgical therapy for this is use of intracameral air, SF6 or C3F8 gas, and one can even do penetrating keratoplasty. Now, this is just to show how we deal with these cases. If you see the anterior segment OCT, and this is just for me to, explain to you better. You can see that there are large clefts which are present here. So these are fluid-filled spaces. So you've already injected the SF6 there, and now we are just giving stab incisions anteriorly so that these fluid-filled spaces are coalesced. So as a result of which, what happens is, because of the tamponade that is there, and because of the coalescence of these intrastromal cysts or fluid pockets, the corneal thickness would decrease, and this will lead to an early resolution of the acute hydrops. So a person who was looking like this in the preoperative, you can say preoperatively, the corneal edema is this much. So over a period of time, what happens? The corneal edema, it resolves, and there's a faint scar which is present here. So what is the advantage? The advantage is that this thing which was present centrally was obscuring the visual axis, now has come in the paracentral area, and the patient is able to see well through this area, which is relatively clear. And notice how in the anterior segment OCTs, this decreases. Now, in your exams, you may be given a picture of anterior segment OCTs like this. So you need to know the diagnosis. So this is how another case, which improves. What happens? You may even improve the vision with a contact lens fitting in these cases without having to do a corneal transplant. Now, in all cases of keratoconus, you need to do keratometry, topography, which could be a VKG or could be OpScan, and very often now people do pentacam. Then 9-point pachymetry, which could be ultrasonic or could be done on pentacam or even on anterior segment OCT, and axial length. So this is what I was talking about. You see this picture. This is classically a picture of keratoconus because this area is hot. On the pentacam, whatever is steep would appear red, and the areas which are flat would appear bluish or greenish in color. And this again, if you look at this OpScan picture, so this is the infratemporal cone of the keratoconus. This corroborates with the posterior ectasia, anterior ectasia. You can see that this is also the thinnest point. So everything is corroborating. So when everything corroborates, that means it is a case of keratoconus. And this is just to show that we use best fit sphere for pentacams. And again, there everything has to corroborate. These are the cutoff values. Anterior elevation, if it is more than 10 microns, posterior elevation more than 15 microns, pachymetry less than 450 microns, that means it is a case of keratoconus. So everything should corroborate. See red here. So on a refractive map, there is a cone which is here. Then if you look at the corneal thickness, the thinnest area is also here. Then if you look at the tangential map, again the red spot is here. And then if you look at the back elevation, again the red spot is here. And then if you look at the pachymetry, again it's thinned out. So it's a red on red everywhere. That means this is keratoconus. And this is not ectasia. Why? Because in the center it is hot. That means it is steeper here. But if you look at the tangential curvature, it is not. And if you look at the pachymetry map again, it is not the thinnest part. So that means it's a red on blue, and this is not a case of keratoconus. And like I was telling you, pellucid marginal degeneration, you have a classical butterfly pattern. So only inferiorly would be steepened out because it's thinned out inferiorly. And this is a case of keratoglobus where all around globular 360 degrees it is thinned out, and it is ectatic, and so it is steep, and so it is all red in color. So based on the morphology, disease evolution, ocular signs, index-based systems, or a combination of these, you can classify the keratoconus into various kinds. So I think if you just remember that it could be mild, moderate, advanced, or severe, this is based on keratometry alone, it will be good enough. But this is the classification which we all follow, the Amsler-Kromisch classification, which is based on the corneal bulge, on the amount of astigmatism, on the corneal radii, or what you say, the keratometric value, and the Vogt stria, whether they are present or not. So you can classify them into stage 1 to stage 4, depending on the severity. And this is the management protocol that we follow. This is very much published. So if there's a case of keratoconus, in the initial stages, you will give spectacles, contact lens, and cross-linking. And you may give toric IOLs or intracorneal ring segments or combined treatments. Then depending on the corneal thickness, if it is more than 380 microns, you can do a lamellar procedure like ALTK, DLK, and femtosecond laser. But if it is less, you cannot use a automated microkeratome there because it will perforate. So you can do a DALK procedure or femtosecond guided anterior lamellar keratoplasty. If there's peripheral thinning, you need to reinforce that thinned out area. So you do a tuck-in lamellar keratoplasty. And if it is a healed hydrops or corneal scar, then you do a full thickness penetrating keratoplasty. So what happens in early stages of keratoconus? You give only spectacles or you give contact lenses, which could be of various types, which are shown here. RGP or rigid gas permeable is the one which is the most commonly used, and this is the fitting philosophy if you see here. So there's a 3-point touch. In the center there is a touch which is on the apex, and then there is a paracentral area where there will be a touch with the fluorescein. So if anybody asks you, just say 3-point touch with RGP, they know that you know what would be the contact lens fitting in a keratoconus. Then sometimes you have these piggyback lenses where you have a gas permeable lens which is there. So you have a soft part which is there in the periphery, and you have a central part which is rigid, or you can have scleral contact lenses or hybrid contact lenses, but these are more expensive. Then you have Rose K lenses. In Rose K, you need to know two things, Rose K2 and Rose K IC. IC means it is an irregular cornea. So Rose K for irregular corneas. And I think these two pictures will clarify very easily. If you put a standard lens and there's a cone which is present here, pooling will occur here in the area which is behind the cone. So you don't want that to happen. So what is a Rose K lens? It's like a tailored lens, like a customized lens, which fits that particular cone, that particular eye, just to have, fitting of your dresses likewise. So they have to be ordered or customized for each individual. Now, these are just outcomes of contact lens in advanced keratoconus, and these patients generally have very good vision, so you should defer corneal transplantation procedure for as long as possible. Then you have the intracorneal ring segments, which act by arc shortening effect on the corneal lamellae, which flatten the central cornea. And again, I'll show you a picture to understand this. And they are of two types. They could be the intacts or they could be Ferrara rings, but nowadays we just have intacts. This has gone out of vogue, the second one. So what happens, this is the cone which is present, and if you put the intacts here like this is in cross section, this becomes flattened. So you can see this is a curved here and this becomes flattened here by the arc shortening effect or arc shortening model. So the more somebody asks you what is the mechanism of intacts, you say it's arc shortening, your job is done. So what happens? The magnitude of flattening is directly proportional to the thickness of the implant and inversely proportional to its diameter. Now, advantages are it is reversible, stable, it does not affect the central corneal visual acuity, it is inserted in the posterior stroma at 75% depth, and there are circular intralamellar pockets which are created using vacuum lamellar dissectors or femtosecond laser. And limitation would be extrusion. You can see sometimes they get extruded, they can get infected, then you can see this opacification that is there a little bit, that can be there. And sometimes there can be AC entry also, and they can be combined with other procedures which I'll be talking to you about. So this is how these intacts are inserted for all those who have not actually seen it, but I'm sure there are a lot of videos you can see on the YouTube. So what happens is that you mark the area of the channels where you have to put the channels, and this is the microkeratome, just like a LASIK microkeratome, which is making this this entry and forming these channels. And once these entry or channels are formed, then you take the intacts. This is PMMA material. So this is taken and this is inserted so that the central area is, completely flattened. And then we put a suture there, and this is how this surgery is done. So these are just to show the results of the same, and the results are quite good with, although complications are there, but in an odd case they may occur, they're generally rare. Then I think you have a lecture already on corneal collagen cross-linking. Sagar, is it true? I think there's a whole lecture on it.
Yes, ma'am, it's there, ma'am.
Okay, so I think I will just skip it. I'll just tell you one thing and the mechanism. So collagen cross-linking uses riboflavin or vitamin B2 and ultraviolet rays, and it is there to halt and stabilize the keratoconus. So in this case, what happens is that the UVA rays are generated. They generate reactive oxygen species, induce covalent bonds between the collagen fibrils in the stroma, and generally the corneal thickness for them should be 400 microns or more. They are contraindicated in less than 400 microns. So these fibrils, there will be more cross-linking and the cornea will become stronger. Now this is just to show the procedure of the same. So what is done for collagen cross-linking? This is slightly important because this is the only procedure which is curative. So with 20% alcohol, what is done is that the epithelium is debrided, and then subsequently after debriding the epithelium, the riboflavin is instilled, and this is done for 30 minutes every 2 minutes, and then UV radiation is given, so the cornea becomes a little stiffer. Now I will just skip this because you already have a whole class on it. And I will come to corneal transplantation. So generally, like I said earlier, defer keratoplasty for as long as possible, and anterior lamellar keratoplasty can be done manually or can be done by using microkeratome in cases of moderate to advanced keratoconus with corneal thickness of more than 380 microns in cases which are contact lens intolerant. Then on the other hand, deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty you do when the corneal thickness is less than 380 microns. And in a very advanced cases with healed eye drops, with corneal scarring, you have to do a penetrating keratoplasty. Now, this is just to show how you do automated lamellar therapeutic keratoplasty. So this is a 500 micron cornea and a microkeratome is taken, and you split this cornea into anterior 350 microns and posterior 150 microns. And this is a healthy cornea, and this is a case which has a keratoconic cornea. So again, in this 250 microns are removed in this keratoconic cornea, and you take this healthy cornea from this side, and then tightly suture this healthy cornea onto the recipient bed with tight sutures so that it completely flattens the cone and flattens the cornea. And the size of the graft should be either same size or there should be a disparity of 0.25 millimeter. Now this becomes important because normally you have a disparity of 0.5 millimeter, 0.5. Here it should be same size or 0.25 because you want to flatten the cone. Now this is just to show you the the deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty. So what is done in this case is that partial thickness trepanation of the cornea is done, and please watch this. This is like an animation, although it is intraop OCT microscope. So air bubble is instilled. So once you instill the air bubble, the Descemet's membrane falls at the back. This is an inverted picture, and as you give a nick in the overlying stromal layers, the air egresses out. As the air egresses out, the Descemet's membrane is marching towards the stromal layers. So the idea is that this procedure is extraocular. You have not entered the eye at all. You have not entered intraocularly. And once this air bubble egresses out, again you reinforce this compartment with the help of viscoelastic agent, and just see like a kangaroo's pouch, this goes at the back. And then you are still working on a bare Descemet's membrane over which the viscoelastic cushion is present, and the entire stromal layers are removed, and this is the bare Descemet's membrane now which is staring at you. And you are extraocular, you've not entered the eye at all, so there will not be any intraocular complications like cataract, like synechia, like glaucoma. All these would be avoided. Now, how does the patient look like? These are some of the pictures to show you how DALK behaves. and there is good success rate in terms of visual acuity. The only problem is sometimes you may perforate a Descemet's membrane. So if you perforate, then you may have to convert to a full thickness penetrating keratoplasty. And whenever there's a scar which is present, then like I told you earlier, the graft host disparity is same size or 0.25 millimeters. So there's a healed eye drops here. And because it is coming in the visual axis, the full thickness cornea is removed. Then you put viscoelastic over there. And then this is sutured with 10-0 monofilament nylon sutures. Then keratoglobus, again, there are options. You can put contact lenses, or you can do a corneal transplantation procedure in which you do tectonic large lamellar keratoplasty followed by central PK, or what we do in these cases is tuck it in lamellar keratoplasty. In cases of pellucid marginal degeneration, again, there are a lot of options which include contact lenses, intracorneal ring segments, wedge resection, lamellar keratoplasty. But again, for these cases, for keratoglobus and pellucid, what we are doing is tuck-in keratoplasty now. Now, I'll show you what the procedure is. The advantage of this procedure is that it is a single-stage surgery, preserves the limbal stem cells, and tectonic support to the peripheral cornea is there. So this is how this technique is done, and this was a technique which was described by Professor Vajpayee, who in fact was supposed to give this lecture. And we've all learned our corneal transplantation procedures from him at RP Center, and a lot of other new techniques. And so I want to acknowledge his contributions to corneal transplantation. So what you have here is you have a central part of the cornea, which is full thickness from which the Descemet's is removed. And this peripheral part of the cornea that you see is just a flange. So, so what happens is that if I show you this
200 microns.
If I show you this diagram, what happens is this is the case of keratoglobus. So what you do is that you do a partial thickness dissection, and after doing a partial thickness dissection, there is a pocket, the anterior part of the corneal layers are removed, and there's a pocket then which is there, which is reinforced all around. Then this is a full thickness donor which is being refined, and this peripheral frill, which is about 0.5 millimeters, is removed. Now, after removing this, AC paracentesis is done because the whole cornea is bulging and you want that to be flattened. And that will only be flattened if you do a little bit of AC paracentesis and you just tuck this peripheral pocket into the periphery of the cornea. So just notice this part of the cornea would become reinforced. And this is just to show the suturing part, which is a little different. And this is all the sutures out. So the patient's visual acuity is 6/9, all the sutures out. You can't even make out that there was a corneal transplantation done. So this is the beauty of this procedure, and the stem cells are preserved, the visual rehabilitation is there, and this is a procedure which is, a single stage surgery. You don't have to do 2-stage surgeries for this. And this is again a pellucid marginal degeneration case in which this part of the cornea which is there, which is thinned out. So your peripheral flange is only that much, where thinning is present. So this is sectoral flange which has been taken, because like I told you, in pellucid marginal degeneration, it is the only inferior part which is thinned out. So it is only the inferior part which is being reinforced and which is being tectonically stabilized. So again, this is tuck-in lamellar keratoplasty, but this is sectoral. So again, look at this. This is another case, and this will just move at the back in the periphery. It will get reinforced. And of course, full thickness penetrating keratoplasty, I've already told you, when there's significant scarring, endothelial abnormality, and if you're not too well versed with the DALC procedure, the advantages are that you have good quality of vision and there's no extra instrument or machine which is involved in it. And this, I want to have a look at this, because this is going to be the future, especially when you are going to have paucity of good quality donor material. Now, again, a question which will be asked to you in the exams and which you should mug up is, how many corneal transplants are done and how many corneas are required and how many do we get? So you just mug up these figures. There's no other way out. So we actually require 2 lakh corneas per year. We get 50,000 corneas per year. We are doing 25,000 transplants per year. So it is very easy to remember: 25, 50, 2 lakh requirement. Okay. Now, what happens is that this I wanted to show you, because if there's going to be paucity of good quality donor cornea, then this is going to be the future. So what is this procedure? In this, what is done is a femtosecond laser is taken to create a pocket. Somehow it is not moving. Anyway, I have to move it. So there's a pocket. This part of the cornea is split, and then with the help of the lamellar dissector, this pocket is reinforced. And this is actually a synthetic cornea which is made out of recombinant collagen. I am, emphasizing on the material because this is something which may be asked. And then this is folded with the help of the forceps. It's placed inside the pocket, and this looks pretty much like your soft contact lens, but it is stiffer than that. And then this is unfolded inside the cornea, and then you place a bandaged contact lens. So what happens? You have reinforced a thinned out cornea and added corneal thickness to it. And this can subsequently be cross-linked also. So this is a book on deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty, and there is another book on corneal transplantation, the next edition of which is going to be available soon. And thank you very much for your kind attention. And if there are any questions, I would be happy to take them.
Madam, it was an excellent talk on keratoconus. I think in 30 minutes you have covered each and every aspect which is important from the postgraduate's point of view. And I think what you said is absolutely right. If you just see this presentation, I think your preparation is absolutely done. So there is one question that has come up, madam.
Yes.
Why keratoconus affects only the inferior cornea? Yeah. Why keratoconus affects the inferior cornea?
So there is no true explanation for that, but yes, infratemporal cornea is the one which is the most commonly involved. Maybe because the infratemporal cornea is the one which is also the most thinned out. If you look at the pachymetry of normal corneas also, then that is the area, which is most thinned out. But otherwise, there is no such reason, why the predilection is more for infratemporal corneas, which are most thinned out.
Yes, ma'am. So there is another question. I think a commonly asked question, probably in Viva also they must be asking. What is form first keratoconus? What is subclinical keratoconus? How do you differentiate?
So see, if you look at the literature, there is an overlap between the types of keratoconus, form first and subclinical keratoconus. And form first keratoconus is essentially a case in which the other eye has keratoconus and this is normal. So that is form first keratoconus. Nowadays, nobody says it's unilateral keratoconus. Unilateral keratoconus is a term which is gone. So if one has keratoconus and the fellow eye is normal, then the fellow eye is a form first keratoconus. Because you have to then keep following those cases. One is this. Two is this. You said the subclinical keratoconus. Subclinical keratoconus would be the ones which will have some features of keratoconus, maybe in the form of pachymetry, which is less, or maybe the posterior float will be more, or borderline cases. Those would be subclinical keratoconus. So they can be bilateral also.
Correct. So I think that was one thing, and another question that has been asked, I think that is related to the pathology only. They were asking about the different site of cornea protrusion in keratoconus and PMD. Probably these are two different conditions. So
keratoconus is generally infratemporal, which is cone is the commonest, but it can be there anywhere. Pellucid marginal degeneration is classically inferior. Right. Classically inferior, and then you have a normal area which is also there above the protrusion.
Right, ma'am. There is one more question, ma'am, about compression sutures for hydrops.
So compression sutures for hydrops are being given, and there was a paper which I recently reviewed. So it's a good modality. It's a new modality which is being tested, and of course, it is an option very much there.
Okay. I think there's another question. How do we manage centric keratoconus versus peripheral keratoconus? I mean, the cone position, I think they wanted to ask. How different is management? Yeah.
So the peripheral keratoconus, like I told you, you would manage with your lamellar keratoplasty. If it is severe, Having said this, and the central keratoconus, any keratoconus, whether peripheral or central, first would be your contact lens fitting. If your contact lens fitting is possible, please do that, and defer corneal transplantation as long as possible, because corneal transplantation means the story begins there. It doesn't end there, because the patient will have to follow up for the whole life for his graft. So try and rehabilitate the patient with spectacles or with contact lenses, even scleral contact lenses, or rose K lenses or scleral lenses, whatever is available, options available. And only when you're not able to refract them, or the patient says that he's visually handicapped, even with that he's not able to get a good vision, or contact lens intolerant, in those cases only surgery is an option. So for central keratoconus, it will be lamellar keratoplasty, which could be manual lamellar keratoplasty or could be ALTK. For peripheral keratoconus, or from what I understand, it means if the periphery is thinned out, elicit marginal degeneration, or there in those cases you will do a tuck-in lamellar keratoplasty or TIL.
Right. I think, madam, these were the questions that they had asked. Let's. I think we can move on to the next topic.
I think there's one more I can see,
Yeah,
and again,
yeah.
somebody brilliant has asked this question. Bowman transplant.
Yeah.
So just like I showed you the bioengineered corneas with the synthetic material. Likewise, you can also take a healthy Bowman's membrane from a cadaveric cornea, and this is a technique which was described by Jarrett Mellis. So that can be taken, and Bowman's layer is difficult to dissect, more difficult than Descemet's membrane is, but that can be taken, and similarly in the same manner can be put in the pocket, as I showed you, after creating a pocket with the femtosecond or even manually. And the advantage of that technique is that it splints the keratoconic cornea. So again, it kind of gives support to the keratoconic cornea.
Right. Right, ma'am. There are no further questions, I think.
Okay.
Yes. So we can go ahead with the next talk.
So next talk I'm going to take is peripheral ulcerative keratitis, and the importance of this talk is that again it can come as a long case and it can come as a short case. It can come as a spotter.
I think we lost the connection.
Yeah, I think sir, she just.
आप बात कर लीजिए मनीष जी, मैम.
Yes, sir, I'm calling. Yes, sir.
For those who have joined a little late, I would like to once again introduce today, Dr. Namrata Sharma, though she does not need any introduction.
Sir, I'm meeting call. You can.
Sorry, I think I got disconnected.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
We can hear you. चंद्रशेखर जी, आपके पे आवाज आ रहा है.
Hello.
Yes, doctor, you are audible now.
Yeah, now I am
yes,
audible. No,
yes,
I got disconnected, I think.
Yeah.
So now I'll give the second one.
For the benefit of the postgraduates who have joined a little late, though ma'am does not need any introduction, I'll introduce her for the second presentation. Her second presentation is on bacterial keratitis. Professor Namrata Sharma is a professor at RP Center, New Delhi, and she is the secretary of All India Ophthalmological Society. We are very grateful to her for her presentation, which she made on corneal ectasia just now, which was to be presented by Professor Rasik Bajpai, but he could not present due to some engagement. And now we will begin with the second presentation on bacterial keratitis. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Am I sharing my slides are sharing? No,
Your screen is coming.
it's okay now. Can you see the slides?
Now it's coming.
Okay, so I will be talking to you about peripheral ulcerative keratitis, and PUK, like you can see here, is a crystal destructive inflammation of juxtalimbal corneal stroma. With the presence of stromal inflammatory cells, progressive stromal degradation and thinning, and there's conjunctival, episcleral, and scleral inflammation which may be present. Now, the symptoms, you can see generally in the peripheral part of the cornea, there would be an ulcer. The symptoms are foreign body sensation, severe pain, redness, tearing, photophobia, visual disturbances, which could be gradual or it could be sudden when PUK progresses. Now, systemic history is important, so you should ask the patient constitutional symptoms such as chills, fever, decreased appetite, weight loss, fatigue, skin disorders, respiratory, cardiac, GIT, and neurological symptoms. Because you have to rule out rheumatoid arthritis, SLE, PAN, Wegener's granulomatosis, and relapsing polychondritis. So extent of the ulcer is important. So it could be circumferential or it could be central, and you can grade it depending upon the area of the ulceration, which could be less than 25%, 25 to 50%, or 50 to 75%, or 75 to 100%. Depending on that, it could be from grade 1 to grade 4. And then scleral involvement is generally diffuse, nodular, or necrotizing, and necrotizing scleritis indicates the presence of systemic disease. So systemic disease is important. Again, you have to look at the lesions of the skin, face, trunk, joints, extremities, and diagnosis of PUK in a collagen vascular disease may require multiple evaluations by a rheumatologist or clinical immunologist. Now, PUK, you should always rule out an infectious etiology, because in India, almost half of the cases of peripheral ulcerative keratitis are because of infection. So it could be bacteria such as staph, streptococcus, moraxella, haemophilus, or gonococcus, or it could be virus such as herpes simplex or herpes zoster, or it could be even a acanthamoeba or fungus. Then you can have non-infectious causes, and if you don't have a cause or idiopathic, then it is Morans, or it could be Tyrians or pellucid, which I talked to you about. Then blepharitis can also present like this. But I think most notably in this case, important thing is that it could be a Morans ulcer. Then it can be associated with autoimmune disorders such as episcleritis and scleritis, and episcleritis and scleritis may precede the onset of keratitis. Then there can be other ocular features like uveitis and retinal vasculitis. Morans as classically as shown, so there would be an overhanging edge which is present, which would be irregularly scalloped, and the extent of the corneal damage is always more than the obvious during the slit lamp biomicroscopy, and the thinning of the damaged area is peripheral to the advancing edge. Then there can be reepithelialization, scarring, or vascularization. So this is a case of malignant Morans. Notice that the whole cornea is melted in the right eye, and the left eye there is a peripheral Morans ulcer which is present. And again, because like I told you, there are so many systemic diseases involved which can cause Morans. So you should always do a microbiology workup as well as lab investigations like a complete blood count, ESR, urine analysis, rheumatoid factor, ACE enzyme, which is increased in sarcoidosis, anti-nuclear antibodies, which are positive in SLE and rheumatoid arthritis, anti-double-stranded DNA, which is there for SLE, and ANCA. Then you may have to do Raji cell assay, and all these to rule out systemic disorders. Then X-rays may have also to be done for the same reason. And these are some of the examples. So this is herpes simplex, this is staphylococcus, then you have Morans, then you have Wegener's, and then you have a Morans malignant, which you can see on right side, both of them are Morans. Now the treatment of PUK depends on the severity of the corneal disease, extent of the extraocular involvement, and the goal of the medical therapy are to reduce inflammation, promote epithelial healing, and minimize stromal loss or prevent recurrences. So if it is infectious, you would give antibacterial, viral, or fungal agents as the case may be. If it is immunological, you will give topical steroids, and when there's healing, then the steroids are tapered and they are stopped over months. And if it's a marginal ulcerative keratitis with no systemic involvement, then you may have to concentrate on eyelid hygiene, topical steroids, and antibiotics. Lubricants have to be given. Then collagenase or collagenase synthetase inhibitors have to be given topical 1% medroxyprogesterone in QID doses and topical 20% N-acetylcysteine in QID doses along with cycloplegics. Now, if it is this is just to show what antibiotics you would give if it's a if it's a PUK because of microbial keratitis. And then these are just the doses of systemic collagenase inhibitors, which is tetracycline 250 milligram QID or doxycycline 100 milligram BD for initial 1 month. And then sometimes you even have to give systemic steroids. Persistent ulceration is there after 7 to 10 days. And generally, topical steroids may not be safe because that can initiate or perpetuate a perforation, but systemic steroids can be given. And sometimes you have to also give systemic immunosuppressives. So these are just cases to show you. So if you look at this case on the top, it is staphylococcal PUK, which healed on cefazolin and tobramycin. If you see the second case, again, it is a staphylococcal peripheral ulcerative keratitis. And because in this case, part of the sclera was also involved, so we had to give systemic ciprofloxacin as well. Now, this one was because of aspergillus, so we gave natamycin and ketoconazole, and this one, the bottom one, was because of herpes, so we gave acyclovir 400 milligram 5 times a day and acyclovir ointment. Now, when do we give topical steroids? So these are generally given when the cause is immunologic and you completely ruled out a microbial etiology. When it is involving less than 2 quadrants and less than 50% of the corneal thickness, and patient is followed up every 3 days till healing and then monthly for 6 months. On the other hand, this is just to show this is a case of Murun's ulcer, which has healed on topical steroids. And this is a case, again, of peripheral ulcerative keratitis, where topical cyclosporin A was given. Here, in this case, both topical cyclosporin A and topical steroids had to be given. Now, when do you give systemic steroids? When the cases are bilateral, more than 2 quadrants are involved, more than 50% stromal lysis is there, not responding to topical steroids, and it can be combined with the immunosuppression. So the dose is oral prednisolone 1 to 1.5 milligram per kg body weight, and oral ranitidine, which can also be given. In some cases, they will still not respond, such as this case. This is a bilateral case, right eye and left eye, and notice the picture on the bottom, it is so severe. So you may have to give, in bilateral cases, one-eyed patients where there's more than 3 quadrant involvement, more than 50% stromal lysis, impending perforation, IV methylprednisolone, 500 to 1000 milligram per day for 1 to 3 days, or you can combine it with cyclophosphamide. If there's a frank perforation, if it has become even more severe, and such patients are generally admitted in the ward when you are giving them IV methylprednisolone. Now, systemic steroids you cannot use for a long time because it will cause all these problems which we are all aware of as we have studied in medicine. So we like to use systemic immunosuppressive. So when to use it, how to use it, and what to use, that is the issue, and what can go wrong. So steroid, if it is intolerant, or steroids if they are contraindicated, then they have to be used in bilateral and or progressive peripheral ulcerative keratitis, which is not responsive to conventional medical and or surgical therapy. And in this case, these are the immunosuppressive agents which can be used, and I've put them in the same color because the same color should not be combined with each other because their mechanism of action is similar. So they have to be given. They cannot be combined. So you cannot combine cyclophosphamide with azathioprine, but you can combine prednisolone with azathioprine. Or you can combine azathioprine with cyclosporin if it becomes very severe. So fulminating disease requiring rapid control to prevent loss of eye, initially you will give systemic steroid, start the steroid sparing drug when a prolonged disease course is expected, and sometimes you may have to add cyclosporin A to it. So this is one chart which will help you to know how immunosuppressants are given. So initially you give Dapsone. If it is not getting all right, you give methotrexate or cyclosporin. Not getting all right, then you give mycophenolate. If it is still not responding, then cyclophosphamide plus minus oral steroids or IV immunoglobulin can be given. So these are the doses for all those who want to know the doses of each of these agents. And as the disease gets better, you will taper them. But you will taper cyclophosphamide definitely after 1 year because it causes hematuria. So that is why you cannot give it for more than 1 year. Others can be tapered depending upon the response. And this is a very busy slide, but in one chart gives you the side effects of all the drugs. So you can follow these patients and you can note down the side effects at every follow-up visit they come. And in one chart, if you just have this page, you know what you have to look for if they are on particular drugs. So these are just these are available, and I think probably this will become too much for you, the doses of each of these drugs. So I am just skipping this. Of course, there are side effects of these immunosuppressive agents which has to be taken care of. And there are surgical methods by which one, treats them. One is superficial lamellar keratectomy or conjunctival recession. So I'll just show you the video of this. Okay, this is not moving. So what you actually do is you have to recess the conjunctiva. So it is done 2 cloacars at both the edges and then about 4 millimeters away from the area of the ulceration. And the idea is that you don't want the inflammatory cells coming in contact with the area of ulceration, and so you try to recess it. It's not moving again. So this is after conjunctival recession. So this was the Moran's ulcer that you see, and then once you recess the conjunctiva, this is healed. Tissue adhesives have to be given whenever there is any perforation, and this is moving. So this is, although not peripheral ulcerative keratitis, but I've just shown how it can be used. A glue and a patch can be used just to cover the area of the ulceration, and then a bandage contact lens can be applied on this. Then you can do even amniotic membrane transplantation for these cases. In this case, amniotic membrane was put, and so this has caused the healing. And one can even do, I don't know whether this will move or not. I think it is again not moving. So you can do multi-layered amniotic membrane again for the peripheral lesions such as this. And then sometimes, when it gets really perforated, you have to deal it with the patch graft, such as this, a peripheral ulcerative keratitis for which a patch is being done. And after giving the repositing this area of the ulceration back, then a patch graft, which is the size of this, is put with the help of the sutures. You measure the area of a graft, and then this graft is taken and is sutured onto the area which is ulcerated. Somehow there is a problem with the cursor in this presentation, and it doesn't seem to move forward. And these are just cases to show how you can do patch grafts in cases of Moran's, which could be full thickness, or which could be full thickness, or could be partial thickness. And again, I think this is not going to move, but this was a PUK for which a crescent patch was done. You can see the pre and the post-op picture. And again, Moran's, where crescent patch has been used to cover the area of Moran's. And this is a case of malignant Moran's. So the entire 360 degrees is gone. So again, in this case, what you do is a 360 degrees corneal patch is taken from this area, and the conjunctiva is also recessed. So always do peritomy in these cases, because you don't know the area of the ulceration. And after doing peritomy, then subsequently the membrane which is there on the area of the ulceration is removed, and then a graft is placed on this area. Now, this is keratoepithelioplasty, a procedure which was described by Dr. Kinoshita. And in this case, again, what is done is that the limbal stem cells are taken, and then they are, you can see that the limbus is taken along with the patch graft, and then it is placed on the area which is perforated, and so that it heals over a period of time. Now, sometimes you may have to, I don't know whether this is a very severe melt for which a very large sclerokeratoplasty was done. And again, you have to remove this entire area of necrosis. You have to find an eye from somewhere, And notice it is so necrotic, and then all these patients post-operatively, this is the necrotic iris which is being removed, and then a full thickness cornea is taken, and this is a large graft which is taken and then is sutured with the sutures onto the hole, because this is the rehabilitative procedure for this. So cases of PUK need to be given medical therapy concomitantly when you are doing the surgical management, and surgery may be need to be taken for tectonic to reinforce of operation, and vigilance is required about the recurrence of the disease, because so many times you have done the grafts etc. and may still recur from the edge of the graft. This is the case I showed you earlier also. Left eye severe damage and right eye melt, so mycophenolate and cyclosporin was given. So finally, for this eye where melt was there and desmetoscele happened, we had to do a sclerokeratoplasty in the left eye, and this is how there was again a recurrence from the area supranasal area that you see, which was again managed on immunosuppressives, and this is the graft which has been done in the other eye on infliximab. So these, I just want to highlight the fact that the management of these cases can be really tricky and can be really prolonged. So it is important to ascertain the etiology, document the inflammation, treat appropriately, start the immunosuppressives cautiously, have follow-up protocols, plan the withdrawal strategies, and prevent and watch for recurrences. And I would like to acknowledge Dr. John Dart, from whom I have learned all my concepts on peripheral ulcerative keratitis in this presentation. So I think that's it. If there are any questions, I will be happy to take them.
Thank you, madam. Again, a very difficult topic and so nicely covered. Giving details about everything. So great. There are still no questions as of now. Let me ask you one thing. We all know PUK is in a very severe form, but a lot of times you can, I've seen people mistaking simple Delin to a PUK. So how do you clinically diagnose a Delin and, kind of differentiate it from an early PUK, early stage PUK?
So early stage PUK and Delin, there will be a difference, because if you stain it, then you can actually see that in Delin, there'll be pooling of the fluorescein. But in a peripheral ulcerative keratitis, there'll be staining of the base of the ulcer. So that is one way of differentiating the two.
Yeah.
Ma'am, can you stop sharing your screen?
Yeah.
It's sharing. Sorry.
So there are a couple of questions that have come up, ma'am. How do you differentiate Moehrens ulcer from an autoimmune PUK? So
Moehrens is a diagnosis by exclusion. So if you do all the various tests which I showed you for PAN, for Wegener's granulomatosis, for SLE, etc., and if you don't find any results on those tests and it's a peripheral ulcerative keratitis with classical overhanging edge which is grayish, then we tend to label it as Moehrens. So it is more of a diagnosis by exclusion.
Yeah, continuing with that Delin issue only, ma'am, there is a question on how do you differentiate between staining and pooling of cornea?
So if you see the pooling of the cornea means when the patient blinks, then you cannot see that the area of the base of the ulcer has taken up a stain. Or if I may put it correctly, the base of the Delin will not take up the stain. But in cases of staining, once you ask the patient to blink, then the base of the ulcer would take up the stain and actually show, if you look in the cobalt blue light, actually show yellowish or greenish stain over there.
Okay. Another question is there, how early should we start steroids in keratoplasty of a case of PUK?
So you should start immediately, provided you know that it is not due to fungal keratitis or due to Nocardia keratitis or due to atypical mycobacteria. All these cases where you should never start steroids if you can rule out these conditions, and most of these PUK cases are immune mediated, so it is best to start steroids for them.
don't see any other question. I'll ask you another question, ma'am. How do you approach patients who are with white PUK, no activity coming for a cataract surgery? How would you advise surgeons who are taking up these kind of cases? What precautions one should take?
So from the area of the PUK, one should not try to make an incision, try to make an incision from the area away from PUK. If it is not grossly thinned out, if it is say less than 50%, or if it is not, then you can undertake a cataract surgery. If it is too much thinned out, again, one has to see how the wound integrity would be when you're doing a phacoemulsification. So that is important. But from an area which is not involved in the process of PUK, the corneal incision can be done. And of course, there should be no activity there, because if it is active, the eye should be completely white. So when do you say it is active? You say it is active when the eye is not white. It is, congested and there are symptoms. So the eye cannot be hot and you be operating on it. So it has to be completely uninflamed eye, which is not very hot. And the eye has to be white. Then you know that there is no inflammation present there.
And would you recommend any steroid cover or an immunosuppressive cover during this surgery, cataract surgery?
During the surgery, no, but yes, afterwards you can give topical steroids. Yeah, topical steroids can be given, and it depends on the cause of PUK. For instance, if it is say something like a Behçet's or something like a SLE, then you would like to, with the physician who's dealing with that, with the physician who's dealing with that particular disease, you would like to take down notes or like to co-manage and see if the patient is already on some systemic immunosuppression, then it is good, because it will also not trigger a recurrence of PUK, because these surgeries tend to cause recurrence of PUK.
Right. There is another question, ma'am. How do you differentiate Murren's ulcer versus TMD, Terrien's marginal degeneration?
So Murren's ulcer versus TMD, Murren's ulcer will have a overhanging edge, whereas Terrien's marginal degeneration would be only thinned out. And Murren's ulcer, you can actually see that there are vessels there, and it's grayish in color. On the other hand, Terrien's marginal degeneration will not be grayish in color; it will be more yellowish in color. And then Murren's ulcer can be there at any place. Terrien's tends to be more superiorly.
I think the photograph that you had shown, actually, one should have a photographic snapshot of that photograph. It is a fantastic photograph. Yeah. I think there are no further questions, ma'am. Anything, Dr. Satyajit, you'd like to add?
The question.
Yeah, there is a question. No. All the questions are covered till now.
So,
yeah.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Namrata Sharma for both the presentations, which were so good that now the postgraduates do not need to even go back and open their books. They can just go through this presentation again in future also whenever they like, and they'll be able to face the examiner without much difficulty. We are so grateful to Professor Namrata Sharma, who has the webinars back to back. I think in the next couple of hours, she'll be attending more webinars through the day, and she is doing so many for the whole country. She has done so much for the ophthalmologists around the country. We are so indebted that she found time for us for this postgraduate program. We are deeply indebted to her. We are very grateful to Dr. Saga Bhargav, who took out time to moderate this. You were in the hospital and you rushed back to attend this, so that you had time. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And as always, I would like to thank INTAS, Chandrasekhar ji and Manish ji for bringing this all together every day for the past 3 months, which we have been doing every day in the evening. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, ma'am, once again.
Thank you, Satyajit. It was very nice effort on Satyajit's side. Very good. A very good program which has been started for the benefit of postgraduates. It's so comprehensive and so much in detail. And I think he's got the best faculty. I saw the glaucoma program also and covered it in so much of details and so comprehensively. I'm sure it's going to be very useful. And the postgraduates are watching from the comfort of their, place where they are. So thank you, Satyajit, for doing this.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Bye.